This PowerPoint presentation is a review of the timeline that is included inside of your textbook. We will not necessarily talk about all of the studies that are listed on the timeline. However, they all have their part in impacting child psychology. So, first one that, again, we won't necessarily talk about, however, is important because Piaget was a biologist. This means that he did a lot of readings and followed the studies of Darwin. Darwin was someone who coined the survival of the fittest, which looked at the importance of adaptation to the environment. And that's exactly how Piaget said that children develop cognitively as they develop an adaptation to the environment. So they're processing their environment and their experience and adaptation to that environment. Watson was the father of behaviorism. You guys remember this from Psych 101. This is all about animal research that they did on rats, pigeons, all sorts of animals because of the fact that they were big proponents of observable, measurable behavior and not proponents of cognitive thinking, things that you can't see. They needed it to be observable and measurable. And rats and pigeons probably don't have the higher level thinking that humans do. You also probably remember classical conditioning. This is not necessarily one of the studies that we talk about. However, it gets integrated into a lot of studies because of the sheer learning that happens through it. So just be familiar again with classical conditioning. Just side note here on the Unit 1 quiz, when I'm asking you about these studies, I will do what you see on the slide. I'll have the name of the research method or theory and then the name of the person. So if you remember one of them, you've got it. And a lot of them will be matching because there's so much information to get through. Then the other conditioning that we know of is operant conditioning. Skinner took Watson's initial theories and came up with the theory of operant conditioning, in which you see consequences are impacting the rate of behavior. Okay, so a reinforcement would increase the rate of that behavior and punishment would decrease the rate of that behavior. So Piaget, he's the first study that we read. He's got 2 readings devoted to him, essay 2 and 3. And as you can see, 1952, not really that long ago. His stories are interesting, or his theories are interesting because they were basically based on the study of his children. He did a lot of naturalistic observations, and from those observations, he developed his own theory of cognitive development. 4 stages, and each stage there are several sub-stages. When we look at language, nature and nurture, Chomsky is one who supports the nature side of this. He proposed that children are born with a language acquisition device, and this is what allows them to, through genetics and maturation, learn language. So when you're doing that unit, he will be one that you will be looking at as a source of information for the nature side. Speaking of nature, the nature versus nurture controversy, which is a very big debate in all development. It's really looking specifically at the question, what is more influential in development, genetics or environment? And we've decided there's not really one or the other, it's how much of which. We will talk about Bandura towards the end of the textbook or the end of the class. He is the founder of the Bobo doll studies. All of these hyperlinks, you can see a video there to kind of look at that Bobo doll study. His social cognitive theory really emphasized the importance of imitation and seeing what a model does and then imitating that behavior and then receiving perceived reinforcement for that behavior. One that you may not have heard of is FANCE. FANCE was all about perceptual development. If you've heard that babies prefer to look at human faces, FANCE studies is where that comes from. So we will dive into FANCE studies and look at how they were developed and how that research came to be the statement that babies prefer human faces by looking at their looking preferences. You probably remember Harlow, or the baby monkey theorist from Psych 101. He's all about attachment, and he was setting out to disprove Freud, who said that attachment is based on nursing. He felt that attachment was based on comfort, contact, cuddling, snuggling, that sort of thing. So we'll look and dissect his research and see kind of how that all came about. Towards the end of the class, we will look at tests and temperament. Temperament is that classification of clusters of behavior: easy, slow to warm up, and difficult, kind of how we describe children. So we will talk about that longitudinal study towards the end. And again, people don't often necessarily know if they have one or another type of baby until they've had a second, because then there's basis for comparison. Another attachment theorist is Bowlby, and we'll talk about Bowlby. Bowlby was a nature theorist, and he believed that babies had inborn attachment systems, things that will draw adults to them and things that will keep adults near them. So we'll talk about that view of attachment. Baumrind, you've heard of him, or I'm sure her before. Diana Baumrind was the one who has hypothesized the 4 different types of parenting styles. We will look at this study that she conducted and look at how those different classifications came about. This is very much an overview of that timeline. Again, the first quiz will have the journal parts, the review of research, and the review of the theories. Bronfenbrenner, this is one again that we won't necessarily talk about, but it's alluded to a lot. It's basically talking again about development and how the child is impacted by all of the things around them, kind of a bullseye model, if you will. Things that are closer to them, microsystem, are going to be more influential than things that are farther away from them. So this gives you an idea. You know, the microsystem here is much more influential than the macro system here. They all have the ability to be influential, but the closest ones are most influential. Vygotsky was much like Piaget. The difference is that Vygotsky was really about the social and physical environment that the child was in. He really thought that cognitive skills come from conversations, social relations, and they require interaction and scaffolding. His 2 big contributions to child psychology are the zone of proximal development and the scaffolding, which takes you from the lower level of that zone to the upper level of that zone. We will talk about him right about middle of the semester. So we talked about Piaget. One of Piaget's measurements of cognitive development was object permanence. And in 1987, a grad student named Renee Bayerjan decided she was going to poke the hornet's nest. She was going to challenge the godfather of child psychology. She went and looked at what Piaget's measurement was and said, I think you're wrong. We will talk about that, and it's a really interesting study. So hopefully you guys will enjoy that. And that is basically a review of all of the theorists. I'm going to stop here because the slides on research methods should be review from Psych 101 or other social sciences classes that you've had. Make sure you just look at them and look at the descriptions, because as I said, a lot of the questions on the quiz are matching. So those will be helpful in answering those.